My name's Brett Davis, and I have interest in finance, economics, and the financial markets, mainly because that's what I do for business. I'm particularly interested in economics, though, and for that reason I chose to explore an economist for my project. In the world of economics, there's three names that stand far outside from the rest. Two of those names are Karl Marx and Adam Smith. Now, we still talk about Adam Smith and Marx today. They're taught in macro and microeconomics classes. They're still cited, but they're going out of style a little bit. John Maynard Keynes, though, is still used heavily. He started out in the early 1900s. He changed the world of economics. He died, and then he made a resurgence in 2008. It's for this reason that I chose John Maynard Keynes as one who is a great leader. I think two areas of his life and his personality made him a great leader and made him stick. The first is obviously the technical side to his personality, his ability to do mathematics, his ability to synthesize information, understand the broad picture of the way the economic world works. The second piece of his personality, a little more interesting, is that social piece, the emotional quotient, the EQ. That allowed him to speak to not only academics, not only to professionals, but also to the layperson, to the citizens out there. And that's probably what made him stick more than the rest of it. So I'd like to approach these two pieces of his personality, and I'd like to start with the social piece. By far, the most interesting thing about Keynes is that he was not a trained economist. He graduated from King's College, Cambridge, with a general degree, and he was more of a philosopher when he graduated. He had no formal economic training and never had sat in any sort of economics exam. So he was a blank slate, one might say. Once he graduated from King's College, he took the government entrance examination. This is an examination that might get one a post with the federal government, for instance. He scored highly enough to be offered a clerk job with the India Company. The India Company managed the affairs of Britain and India, and it also managed the affairs and the interests of Britain from a colonialization standpoint. So he worked with tariffs, he worked with exports, imports, a lot of formulas, a lot of numbers. It was a purely transactional job. In fact, at one point in time, he was responsible for delivering a horse from Britain to India. The irony there is one of the great minds of all time is delivering a horse from one country to another. So he started developing logistical ideas about how companies and how countries interact and how economics works. Many sources say that he found this job pedestrian and boring. But it was at this point that he started grasping economics and he started writing his general theory. So one really can't discount the importance of this part of his life or of this, purely clerk transactional job. There were two other social components of his early years that are very important to developing his leadership skills. The first one is called the Bloomsbury Group. This was a formalized group of philosophers, artists, and writers. And they got together and talked about art, philosophy, writing of the times. They did not talk about mathematics. They didn't touch on science. They didn't touch on politics. They were purely interested in the aesthetics of life. And that got Keynes interested in art. At one point in his life, he became a connoisseur of art and bought and sold paintings. The second influential group that he belonged to was called the Apostles. Now, this was a tangential group to the Bloomsbury Group because this group was made up of graduate students and undergraduate students and graduates of King's College. The intent of the Apostles was to grow and germinate the leaders of the future. They focused on economics, they focused on politics, they focused on leadership, they focused on business. So you can see that throughout his time in his early years, these three social components developed him in a balanced manner. They focused on not only his IQ, his intelligence quotient, but they focused also on his EQ, his emotional quotient, that quotient which says which ones of us might have success at leading people and interacting with them. I found that intriguing about his personality. I'd like to talk a little bit about his economics now. It would be naive for any of us to try to explain Keynes without talking through his economics at least a little bit. Tomes of information exist out there about his economics, and they're very complex. His books are very hard to read, and they are long. Lots of information in them. One could not cover this in the course of a week. However, I only think we need to focus on three components, three tools that Keynes developed that pretty much will define most of his theories and work in an interrelated way with most of his theories. The first one I want to touch on is uncertainty. So Keynes began developing his economics in a time that was post-industrial revolution. There was a lot of technology in existence. Things were moving forward pretty quickly. New advances in production equipment were occurring quite often. And more important, mathematics was progressing very quickly. In fact, Werner Heisenberg was one of the great mathematicians at the time, developed a principle called the uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle indicates that whatever we observe, whatever natural phenomenon we observe, can never be forecast. The outcome can never be forecast. We can only come upon a potential of where the outcome might land. And that outcome is governed by and predicted by wave equations, which are mathematical equations speaking to the probability of the outcome being one way or another. So obviously Keynes became interested in this, and it became one of the principles of his underlying theory. Keynes argued that you can never know what an outcome is going to be in the future. And for one with that type of theory, one would think that he would be a favor or a fan of hoarding money, a fan of the government hoarding money, hoarding resources, extreme savings, but he wasn't. Keynes was in favor of the government spending money, but only in a reasonable manner. So, theory number one, component number one, tool number one, uncertainty. His second tool, built upon uncertainty and intended to manage it to an extent, is government intervention. The economists at the time were fans of laissez-faire economics, meaning keep your hands out of the markets, let the markets regulate themselves, and to an extent, let business regulate itself. Keynes said this would not work, and it clearly wasn't working in post-Depression World War I. Keynes argued that stimulating demand was the way to improve post-Depression Britain, and it worked. His argument was that if the government stimulates demand, private investment will increase and jobs will be maximized. In those two scenarios, the supply side of the economy would take care of itself. And this is basically what happened after World War I and World War II at his urging. So it works. The third component of his theory is best covered by a catchphrase: cheap money, reasonable spending. Keynes recognized that the government was in control of great sums of money in its special account and in its general account. He was not a fan of hoarding that money again. He was a fan of the government keeping spending high. He felt that if the government continued to spend, then private investment would increase as well, and industrial production would increase. However, it wouldn't reach bubbles. It would progress at a normal pace, at a reasonable pace. Finally, cheap money. Keynes argued that the Bank of England's main responsibility, of which he ended up being one of the main managing directors and in charge of monetary policy, was to keep money cheap. That way, borrowing for investment, borrowing for progress, borrowing for research could be kept at a high level. So those are his three theories and tools that I think are most pervasive in today's world, as well as made him very popular and a world economic power in his era. Uncertainty, stimulation of demand and intervention by the government, and cheap money, reasonable spending. So we come to the point where we ask, in the end, what makes a leader great? What makes a leader good? What are the qualities that great leaders have? If we were to take a step back and look at our contemporary leaders, we would probably say some interesting things, but I bet we'd all say the same thing. We would say Steve Jobs is a great leader. We'd say Bill Gates is a great leader. Why? Because they advanced technology, because they made the world easier to live in, because they did something great for the people. We'd also note that their EQs and their IQs are both large. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, perhaps volatile in instances, but they still had the ability to work with people, the ability and the passion to drive things for the people, yet they were technicians in their own right. Let's look at physics. Stephen Hawking. No one would argue that Stephen Hawking has not led the physics world for over 20 years. Again, incredible IQ, grasp of technology, grasp of his own discipline, and an ability, even though with some challenges, to communicate to the common man, to make us all understand what's behind a black hole, what's behind dark matter. These are things that we know to be related to Hawking. Finally, how about Google? So the desire to organize the world, that is a purely large undertaking and a great leadership tactic. We would say that Sergey Brin and Larry Page are great leaders for their undertaking alone and what they've done for us. So, what do they have in common? More importantly, what do they have in common with John Maynard Keynes, who lived over 80 years ago before them? There's three things, and I think we can all agree on this. The first is that they all questioned authority. They all took the designated thoughts of the time and they changed them. They questioned them, they modified them, and they made us better off in the end. They all questioned authority. Number two, they're all technical experts. Their governance of their own disciplines is second to none. Keynes was, when he finally developed his mathematics, he was a brilliant mathematician. He was a brilliant economist. He had a way of synthesizing information from the entire world into one theory that applied to Britain and made it work that no one else could have done. Finally, probably the most important component of all of these is passion. You know, if we don't have excitement about what we do, we don't move forward. No one does. Passion is the most important component of all these leaders and of Keynes. So in closing, I'd argue that Keynes was probably good and long-lasting and enduring because he was passionate, because he had a great balance between EQ and IQ, and because he was a technical master. And in that, you find all 7 traits that Plato argued belonged to the philosopher king. So in the end, Keynes was a philosopher king. I'm Brett Davis. Thank you for listening to my presentation.